or good afternoon. Sorry we didn't reach everybody's destination, where you're living, but thank you so much for joining us wherever you're listening and watching from. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of members of our leadership team, which in addition to me includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome and many thanks to esteemed author and journalist Nick Kristof. Nick has many credits to his name, including his newest book, which is a memoir of his life as a reporter called Chasing Hope. It's wonderful. If you haven't already read it or acquired it, it's now available, I believe, in paperback. And you'll hear more about it tonight. And I'm sure after tonight's program, you're going to want to get yourself a copy. It's very inspiring, great Hanukkah gift, Christmas too. The most important credit I personally give to Nick is that he goes to remote and scary places on Earth where few others have ventured, and brings us the harrowing stories of victims of unspeakable violence and great injustice. I also value that Nick is an innate optimist because his writing is evidence that he believes that once we know what's happening, we will actually join him in bringing voice to the voiceless. So it is our honor to finish out 2024, our 72nd program of the year, with Nick Kristof. Many thanks and welcome, and thank you, of course, to our esteemed moderator, Warren Olney. After tonight, we will have no programs until January 8th, when former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci, will be in conversation with Pat Morrison discussing his lifetime of public service, a look back and a look ahead. And then on January 15th, we'll have Ambassador Dennis Ross bringing us up to date on what is happening in the Middle East. Then the week of inauguration, we will host Jeffrey Greenberg, who is editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. So we have a great January in store for our audience. Whether you celebrate Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or any other December holiday, we wish you a very happy holiday season. I do want to say a word about Hanukkah. Underlying our festive Hanukkah celebration of eating yummy fried foods and exchanging fun gifts is an ancient story about overcoming adversity against odds. It's a story about how a group of dedicated people persisted in their struggle to realize their goal, no matter the difficulties they encountered. So in honor of the essence of the holiday of Hanukkah, which is not potato pancakes and gifts, but actually has this very important values meaning, we at Judge rededicate ourselves to our work and our mission. We will persist in our efforts to bring our audience the highest quality speakers on the most important topics of the day, all aimed at increasing the odds of the preservation of our democracy. We also wish you a happy new year and look forward to seeing you on January 8th with Dr. Fauci. Now, to introduce our guest more accurately and more fully, and to moderate tonight's discussion, please welcome Warren Olney, a man who has dedicated decades to deliver the highest principles of journalism to the American public, and who has continuously been honored for his integrity in reporting and in pursuit of revealing the truth. So now please welcome Warren. Warren, the program is yours.
Dennis, thank you so much. And I think your introduction was very accurate. And I saw Nick was nodding. I think he was accepting it as well. Nicholas Kristof was raised on a sheep farm in Yamhill, Oregon. He's been a journalist since the 6th grade, when he started a paper using a toy printing press. He later worked at the Harvard Crimson, and he started reporting from overseas while he was still a Rhodes Scholar. He also has a law degree. He has been a columnist, a foreign bureau chief, and an editor at the New York Times since 1984, with time off to run for governor of Oregon a couple of years ago until he was disqualified for inadequate residency. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, many other awards, and many honorary degrees. The Washington Post says he rewrote opinion journalism with his emphasis on human rights abuses and social injustice. His most recent book is called Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, as you indicated earlier, and a fascinating and eventful life it has been, making for a fascinating and eventful book. But Nick, it's wonderful to have you with us. It's my privilege to talk with you, and thanks so much.
Great to be with you, Warren. We've over the years we've had conversations about all kinds of topics. I think maybe our first conversation was when we were jointly covering the War of 1812.
Thank you. I was a little mixed up on that one, but I appreciate you clarifying my memory. Let me ask you an interesting question. Jeffrey Toobin, your classmate at Harvard, called you the Indiana Jones of American journalism. And I have this image of you after reading the book, in a Jeep with a backpack, a sleeping bag in the back and a translator at the wheel, driving through countries that I probably almost have never heard of before. It's an image that fits the book, I think, of the Indiana Jones one. So tell us about your ambition to report from foreign countries. Does that go back to the sixth grade?
I think it actually goes back even further, in the sense that my dad was a World War II refugee,
Yeah.
and he, almost executed repeatedly. His life was saved in part because of the intervention of a French diplomat in Yugoslavia when he was in a concentration camp, and so I've always been very acutely aware that lives are on the line in other countries and that attention from the West can make a real difference. And so I think, some combination of that and just the yearning for adventure for a kid who was growing up on a farm in rural Oregon led to that. And then once you begin to cover these stories, they become real, and the people whose lives are at stake become real. I thought I was going to make one trip to Darfur, and then, it's very hard to go from covering a genocide to covering exchange rates and, the latest Fed funds rate or something. And so you want to go back, you want to fight the suffering that you're seeing. And the way I do that is with my laptop and with my camera.
So 150 countries, a lot of them you have visited more than once, as you just indicated, but how do you choose? How do you know in advance which one you want to go to?
So I try to, I try to look for places of great urgency. And so, over the summer, I was in the Middle East because of the war there. But I also look for places that just need more attention. And one thing I can bring is my little spotlight from the New York Times. And so in September, I was in Sudan, or on the Sudan-Chad border, trying to bring attention to the catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Sudan and the famine that is looming there. And I'm just back, Warren, from a trip through kind of southeastern Africa, from Kenya, Madagascar, and the region. And there I thought that again that I could try to use the real estate I have in the New York Times to call a little more attention to global nutrition and global health problems, and the way in which climate change, driven in part by our carbon emissions, is magnifying that crisis for an awful lot of people.
You took a young person with you, as you do on a regular basis. Tell us a bit about that program.
So years ago, it was really during the Darfur genocide, I was trying to figure out how I could get more attention to these stories. And so I had the idea, well, I'll have a contest to take a university student with me on a reporting trip to Darfur, and that'll get more attention on campuses. And so I proposed this internally in the New York Times, and the New York Times lawyer said, "So you want to bring a student to a war zone?" So okay, I backed off and recast it as taking a student with me on a global reporting trip. And so the first one was in 2006. I must say that within the New York Times, the joke is that first prize is a trip with me, and second prize is two trips with me. So, it is a way. What I try to do is use it as a way to call more attention to issues that in journalism we tend not to cover very much. And take nutrition. I mean, more than one-fifth of all kids around the world are stunted from malnutrition. More than one-fifth. That is a huge global moral failing. And we know how to solve that. It's relatively inexpensive. And I think and hope that by covering it, we can whittle that number down so that maybe only 10% are stunted from malnutrition.
You talk about places with a sense of urgency. You have your laptop and your camera. it gets risky from time to time. And you write in the book, I have a routine for approaching people who may kill me. My theory is that it's harder to murder somebody that you have just shaken hands with. How many handshakes like that have you had?
Too many. I mean, I spend a lot of my time kind of scared. And actually, when I was writing Chasing Hope, I self-diagnosed myself. I realized that I'd, maybe had suffered a mild case of PTSD from just being held at gunpoint in too many places. But it's scary when you're in a place where there are warlords and gunmen, sometimes drunken ones, and you're coming to a checkpoint, and you just have no idea how they're going to react to you. And you know, I I owe it to my wife to make sure that I can come back, but I also owe it to the story to cover it and try and navigate my responsibility to my family and my responsibility to stories that I deeply care about. Um, and also, at the end of the day, it's a higher pay grade decision to kill or kidnap a New York Times journalist than it is to do something terrible to your interpreter or to your driver. And I feel a great responsibility to keep them safe. And trying to navigate all this in places like Eastern Congo or Sudan is really tough. I had the kind of good fortune of being scared out of my wits very early in my career when I was a law student freelancing, and in particular there was one occasion where two drunken soldiers held me at gunpoint. And I, at one point, thought they were going to shoot me. And that was a very useful lesson to learn really early on that things can be going just fine. And all of a sudden, they're not. And you have no ability to back up.
So why do you do it? You've already elaborated a bit on the fact that you think journalism ought to have a purpose, but why do you do it? What's your purpose?
You try to do what you can. You tilted windmills, and occasionally, if you tilted enough windmills, occasionally hit one. And it is a function of seeing, it's not an intellectual process. It's an emotional process where you go and you encounter things that are terrible, and you want to fight back. Uh, I I've written a lot about sex trafficking around the world, and that began because of one trip to Cambodia. And I got to a little brothel town where there were young girls who'd been kidnapped, and they were being held there and being sold for their virginity. And they explained that if they had managed to escape, the police would have caught them and handed them right back. And I just could not believe this was happening. It felt just like what I imagined 19th century slavery to be like. And so I go back to my family and to my kids, and it gnaws at me. And I want to go back and fight it. And the way you do that is you have to get real stories. You have to go back into the brothels and talk to the traffickers and get the stories. And, it's the same with genocide, with mass atrocities, that you have to be there if you're going to move people and make them spill their coffee in the morning when they read the paper. And, hopefully, if enough people spill their coffee and are driven to action, then there can be progress. And I've seen um, that, my great power as a journalist is not changing people's minds on topics they have thought about. If I write about gun control, if I write about President Trump, frankly, if I write about the Middle East, I change almost nobody's mind. Where I think we in journalism do have real power is not changing minds on topics they have thought about, but is projecting an issue that is off the agenda and putting it onto the agenda and making people think about topics that are uncomfortable, maybe. And that is the first step. Getting it onto the agenda is the first step toward getting some kind of positive move and policies to address it.
A lot of people say that there's too much advocacy in journalism, but you obviously are an advocacy journalist. Do you get heat from that for that and criticism?
Well, I mean, right now in my case, I'm paid to to be a columnist, so I'm paid to be opinionated. And I'm actually sort of sympathetic to the view that, the most important thing in journalism, I think, is not the opinions, but is the reporting. And I deeply believe that opinion reporting should be rooted in that opinion, columns of opinion advocacy should be rooted in actually going out and shoe leather reporting, getting information. Um, but at the end of the day, I mean, I've walked pretty close to the line sometimes in my career, and it's something I talk about in Chasing Hope. And that's because when you see terrible things, you have a fundamental responsibility as a human first. One of the most searing moments in my career was June 4th, 1989, when I was the Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times covering the Tiananmen Square democracy movement. I was on Tiananmen Square, and the People's Liberation Army troops opened fire on the crowd of protesters, in which I was in the middle of it. And you never forget seeing a modern army use weapons of war against ordinary protesters. And I my reporting there probably wasn't terribly neutral, because I was outraged by what I saw, and trying to navigate that where you were reporting fairly, but also not losing that sense of our shared humanity can be a tough row to hoe.
That was the story or the series of stories that got you your first Pulitzer Prize. And you shared that prize with your wife, Cheryl WuDunn. Tell us how that worked out.
Well, I'm married up. I Cheryl, she was working for the Wall Street Journal in Los Angeles covering business when I was working for the New York Times in Los Angeles covering business, and so we were kind of a KGB, CIA couple. We couldn't talk about anything either of us was doing when we were dating, and so the way to overcome this was to marry her and the New York Times then hired her. Um, and we arrived in China as the only two New York Times reporters covering China about 6 months before the Tiananmen Square democracy movement. And Warren, I look back with a certain amount of shame, maybe, at the way we covered Tiananmen early on. I wrote periodically that the protesters, that they say they're for democracy, but they can't really define the democracy that they're for. That in many ways that they can't describe the institutions they want to create. And I was a little bit scornful of them. And uh, you know, then that terrible night of June 4th, the bravest people I've seen were these uneducated peasants from the countryside who were risking their lives to hold off these the soldiers from the People's Liberation Army. And one of the most unforgettable moments was there was a salt of the earth bus driver, one of these peasants, who he saw a convoy of army trucks coming to crush the students, and he quickly parked his bus across the road to block the trucks and turned the engine off, stepped out of the bus, and the convoy stopped. An army officer got out and ordered him, move the bus. And he said, no. And the officer pointed his sidearm at the bus driver and said, move the bus. And at that point, the bus driver just took the keys in his hand and hurled them into the high grass on the side of the road. And, it was night. They weren't going to find him that night. And, that bus driver, he might not have been able to define democracy, but he was willing to sacrifice for it in a way that I think we Americans could learn from. I think that people like him that I saw that spring, they appreciated democracy maybe more than those of us who simply inherited it may do.
I take it he was shot.
So he was arrested, and
Okay.
I don't know his name, and I don't know what happened to him. It's one of those mysteries. I just don't know.
How about Cheryl, and what role did she play in the reporting of that story?
So she was, she and I were reporting together. And then after Tiananmen, after the crackdown, she became indispensable because look, it's pretty easy for state security to tail me around Beijing. It's a lot, Cheryl is Chinese American, so it's a lot harder for them to tail her in a crowd. And she could, dress like a local and kind of disappear in a big crowd. And it was a lot harder for them. And so she had just excellent sourcing. Um, and people were often willing to meet with her when they were not willing to meet with me. Um, and it was also just, I think, really good for us because it felt really lonely. We were being tailed every time we went anywhere. We were being denounced by state television. And the State Department, the foreign ministry was calling, us in and denouncing us and threatened to expel us. And there we were, I got Cheryl this Chinese scroll painting of these two birds in winter shivering on a little snowy limb. And I thought of, the two of us as these birds in the middle of winter in Beijing. But we had our companionship at least for morale.
I can tell, or I think our audience can tell from what you're saying about these stories, how extraordinarily interesting they are to read about as well as to hear about. Let's talk for a moment about your race for governor in Oregon. That you're still sort of half living in Yamhill and half living in New York, but you thought you were going to win. The polls showed you just might. You decided to do it. You set up a campaign organization. You raised money. Then what happened?
So, I mean, the backdrop, I should say, is that this little town that I'm from, Yamhill, it had gone through the ringer, and at that point, more than a quarter of the kids on my old school bus had died from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And we wrote a book about that. We converted our farm to produce cider and wine as our little small business effort to combat it. But I wanted to, it was just, it's really frustrating when you see a community love suffering in that way. And I thought that Oregon, and frankly, to some extent, the whole West Coast had gone astray, especially the cities up and down, really from the Bay Area through Seattle. And I thought that leadership was needed. And so I made the leap. And the Oregon Secretary of State at the time said that I did not meet the residency requirement. Um, I thought that was political calculation because she was supporting our opponent, but in any case, that was that. So I was bounced out of the race. Um, she then had to resign in a corruption scandal not long afterwards. So, um, it was all complicated. I learned a lot. I mean, it was an amazing experience to run. I'm glad I did it. But and it left me, I must say, with a real appreciation for local politicians. Now when I see a local legislator or a county commissioner, I just want to give them a big hug and thank them for their service.
Tell us a little bit more about Yamhill because you've written about that as well. As you said, you wrote a book about it, and I think your account of what happened there, and also what do you think about the whole West Coast and its failures as you see it. Elaborate a little bit on that, and on some of the friends that you've coffeed, you've talked to as well. Once again, going back to the sixth grade when you started your printing press.
So, I mean, Yamhill is like a lot of working class areas. It was traditionally dependent on basically agriculture, timber, and light manufacturing, and it had not focused all that much on education because back in the day you could drop out of high school and get a job at the mill and a decent job. And so for decades, the Yamhill area had enjoyed a lot of upward mobility. And so the five kids who got on the school bus right after me each morning were my friends, the Knapps. Farland Knapp was the oldest. He was my grade and very bright kid. His brother Zealand, his brother Nathan, their sister Regina, and their baby brother Keelan. Um, None of the Knapps ended up graduating from high school. Their dad had a good union job laying sewer pipe, and their mom had a job driving tractor. I think they thought they could get jobs like that. And those jobs just disappeared. And so Farland died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. He was actually the first person to cook meth in our area. And then his brother Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. His brother Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Regina died of hepatitis from IV drug use, and their baby brother Keelan had survived because he'd been in the penitentiary for drug offenses. And then right at the beginning of the pandemic, he was released, and then he overdosed right at the beginning of the pandemic from, it seems that he was used to heroin and he encountered, something more potent, presumably fentanyl. And so five kids gone just one after the other. And meanwhile, their mom is still alive in her 80s. And that happened way too much in my community. And it at first I thought maybe this is, one school bus, one community. And of course, it's not. It's working class communities like that all across the country. And my friends not only suffered greatly, they also inflicted great suffering on others. One thing I saw was that hurt is transitive as well as intransitive, that hurt people hurt others. And my friends, somebody who wrote a lot about sexual violence, one of the hardest things for me to understand was that two of the boys on my old school bus were sent to prison for raping very young girls. And, how does that happen? On one bus, two boys I knew well, and leads me to believe that they, they made terrible choices, but I think society made terrible choices as well. They exercised a real failure of their personal responsibility, but I think there's also a failure of collective social responsibility to educate kids, to deal with early trauma, to put them on a path where they can get decent jobs. And that has not happened. And working class America right now is kind of a mess.
And is that one of the reasons that got you interested in being a public official yourself, that you think you could do something about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that educated Americans haven't been sensitive enough to the pain in working class communities, and that in general, we also haven't focused enough on education and early trauma. I think that on the West Coast in particular, we have too often have been kind of purist about our approaches, and we we repeat the mantra that housing is a human right, but saying that doesn't actually get anybody housed. And we do a particularly bad job in our blue states where we should be full of compassion at actually getting people into housing. In Oregon, we decriminalized drug use in a very well-meant effort to deal with the problem, and overdose deaths soared. One of my school friends who was homeless and dealing with a mental health crisis, she froze to death one winter night. And one factor was that on the West Coast, it's been very difficult to commit people to institutions against their will, and that is meant as this, way to protect people and help people. But we were not doing Stacy any favors when we made it hard to commit her, and she ended up freezing to death. That was our failure as well as Stacy's.
Your compassion for those people is very moving, and I'm glad you were able to to touch on it. Let me ask you a different kind of question. You've covered countries that have tumbled into civil war, you say, and you also say that that gives you a sense of foreboding about what might happen in this country. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
I mean, um, one of the consequences of this collapse in working class America, I think, is an enormous resentment against against the establishment, if you will. And because, here I am on this farm in rural Oregon, and I have so many friends that I care a lot about who refused to be vaccinated during the pandemic, who turned to Donald Trump when he promised to bring factories back, when he pointed out scapegoats who he said were taking their jobs. And I, you know, I completely disagree with their politics, but I also think it's profoundly problematic when affluent liberals point to these working class folks and say that, well, if they support Trump, they must be racists or bigots. And I think it's way more complicated than that. And that we have to do better at providing solutions for them and alternatives for them, and listen to them and understand that pain. And if we don't do a better job providing remedies for them, then of course they're going to turn to charlatans. So I think that Trump did a terrible job when he was president the last time around. I'm deeply worried about the impact of a Trump presidency on democracy, on all kinds of marginalized communities. I don't think he will help working class Americans. But I understand why people who are disaffected and feel that their communities have been disintegrating, why they're desperate, and when somebody makes promises to them, why they might turn to him.
How concerned are you about Trump's impact on journalism, given what we've seen from newspaper owners? We've seen now ABC and George Stephanopoulos caved in. As many people see it that way. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know that I have to that I can repeat that except to attribute it to somebody else. And now he's threatening to sue a pollster in Iowa whose results he didn't like. What about that? Is he having already a deleterious effect on journalism, as you see it should be practiced?
So I think that journalists themselves will try to uphold their values and cover a Trump presidency diligently. But I think that news organization owners, what they care about is their bottom line.
Mm.
And I think that their bottom line may well conflict with aggressive journalism. And so, uh, I I have no inside knowledge, but I suspect that George Stephanopoulos was appalled by the settlement in that libel case, and that this wasn't an ABC News decision. This was a Disney decision. And likewise, the Washington Post decision not to make an endorsement in the presidential race. That wasn't a Washington Post decision. That was Jeff Bezos, because he has enormous interests with Amazon before that will be before the government. And so I think that's what I worry about, is these larger corporate entities that have one foot in journalism and can be intimidated in ways that restrain those journalists who I think, will really try to do a good job and believe in tough journalism. And of course, the other element of this is that the journalism business model is kind of collapsing around the country. And the New York Times has a good business model. The Washington Post may have, the Wall Street Journal, but regional papers and local papers around the country are just in desperate shape. 2.5 newspapers are going out of business every week around the country. And I think that's a real loss for accountability, for the watchdog function that journalism can play.
Let me step back for a moment and let's go to the chat questions that some of our viewers are asking. I think there's some very interesting questions. Here's Elizabeth. She was the first one to put in a question. Do you have any information about the UAE pressuring the Egyptian government to round up and expel Sudanese refugees back to Sudan? I've heard about this from Sudanese refugees in Egypt who fear for their safety and ask why the U.S. is turning a blind eye.
So the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is playing a disastrous role in Sudan. It has financial interest there. It's getting gold from Sudan, but it also, I think, sees it as a geopolitical asset on the chessboard, and it has been using its financial power to pressure Egypt over Sudan in multiple ways. But I mean, the most awful thing that the UAE has done vis-a-vis Sudan is not just pushing trying to get refugees sent back, but most of all, it's supporting a militia in Sudan called the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, which is the most brutal militia in Sudan. And when I was on my reporting trip in September, I met, all kinds of people whose villages have been attacked by this UAE supported militia, men over the age of about 12, all massacred, women raped, villages burned. And I think what has particularly frustrated me is that the Biden administration did privately pressure the UAE to do better, but it refused to say anything publicly. It refused to raise the cost to the UAE of this kind of murderous behavior. And I think the UAE simply found that massacres paid off and mass rape paid off. And we had the capacity to raise the cost to the UAE of this kind of behavior, and we have not done that.
Phyllis wants to know, do you believe there is enough clarification for the consumer between what is purported to be news as opposed to opinion? It's often unclear where opinion is presented, or excuse me, when opinion is presented as being actual news.
Yeah, there's that fuzziness, and there's also kind of fuzziness about news sources. I would love to see more news literacy training in, actually, generally more civics instruction, but in particular news literacy, so that you had people understand that if they see something on their Facebook page, it's a difference between whether if it's from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. It may be wrong. We make mistakes all the time. But there is some effort to curate accurate things, to check things, to call people up before we report on it. Whereas, there are, Macedonian websites that are simply out to attract eyeballs, and they try to just make things up on the theory that then people will go to them. And I don't think news consumers always understand the difference between, what pops up on their Facebook page. So I'd love to see more efforts to create more sophistication for news consumers, and then of course it goes on to TikTok and other sources, and a lot of that is just there's kind of no verification. It's just stuff that people say, and that what is news has been entirely blurred.
Another question about news from Jim. He says the major complaint of voters is the power that lobbyists and the rich have over our legislatures at all levels. Should the media denounce the excess money in politics?
So, one of the I went into politics in my little 10-minute political career. I went into politics thinking that politics was pretty dysfunctional. And I left thinking, boy, it's even more dysfunctional than I thought. And one element of that was the money in it. I was spending a huge amount of my time calling up wealthy people around the country, getting them to donate. And this was a huge advantage to me because I I did know rich people around the country, so we were able to raise more money than other candidates. But this in no way enhanced Oregon democracy or improved the choice for voters. And so I think that we in the media should stand up against that kind of abuse of power of money, whether it's in elected politics or in lobbying. Uh, I also think that it's fair to note that we have somewhat limited power to change minds, especially when we are perceived as elites who aren't particularly attentive to what ordinary people think. And so we have to have some humility about our power to convince people of, that what we say is actually is something to trust. And, distrust is very high in the media now, unfortunately. And I think in the Trump administration, that distrust may well increase at a time when we're so polarized.
The theme of this program had to do with hope. That was one of the elements in it, and we haven't talked much about that. Susan wants to know, with the new federal administration particularly, do you see hope for the working class?
Yeah, we
It's a tough
have.
question.
Yeah, I'm
Hard to
glad you
ask that
asked that,
question in that
Susan.
context, right?
So, you know, I don't, Trump is not the person I would have turned to elevate the fortunes of the working class. I think we need, above all, real investments in human capital in parts of the country that have been left behind, and investments in economic development. And Biden, to his credit, did some really good things in terms of economic development programs and bandwidth for all. The CHIPS Act, I think, helped. And some of the environmental investments. Um, but it's hard to see. It's hard to foresee. And in Trump's first term, in fact, the working class did okay, and people working class incomes were able to gain, relatively speaking. I'm hoping that is going to continue. I'm hoping there's going to be a serious effort to address addiction and to improve education. These are issues that, you know, neither party, frankly, has been great on. Um, the states that have some of the worst addiction problems, like West Virginia, are Republican. But on the West Coast, we're a mess too. Um, the states with the best public education are those like Massachusetts and New Jersey that are Democratic states. But some of the states that have improved in public education the most are those like Mississippi and Alabama, Florida, which are red states. And so, you know, there's room for everybody these are not classically left-right distinctions, especially at the local level. And I think my guess is that federal policy will be somewhat stalemated in terms of policy initiation for the next 4 years, and that will mean that things that really happen are going to happen at the state level. And in red states, that'll be a much more conservative movement. I'm hoping that in blue states, we can do a better job at fixing some of the messes that we helped create and provide a better model for what liberal governance can be. There is a chance to do a much better job for the working class, including in these places where we still can control the outcomes.
Susan wants to know, do you see any federal, excuse me, that's the wrong question. The question, which I'm not finding, I can't read it directly, was, do you see any financial models for news coverage that are hopeful and bode well for the future?
So at the national level, I think that there I think that there are going to be some news organizations that are strong and do have a business model, and I'm very lucky to be at one of them. There were 15 years ago, there was real uncertainty about the economic future of the New York Times, and now I think we have a pretty solid business model. Um, I think that will be true of some others, but the real crisis is in local journalism around the country, and that there really isn't a business model there. I think that philanthropy will help in some places. And, for example, in the Bay Area, yeah, in Seattle, I can see there are enough wealthy philanthropists who may be able to support local news organizations and provide that base. But I think in a lot of, but my county here, we have a very good paper. Is where I first began working when I was 16 years old, and it's just struggling. It is just struggling, and that's happening around the country. I would never have said this 15 years ago, but now I'd be open to some kind of model for government support for local papers around the country, modeled on the National Science Foundation grants or National Endowment for the Arts. On the theory that if we support a local museum or dance troupe in a community, that's great, but it may be even more important for governance to support a local news organization in that town.
Margaret wants to know, are there champions in the Senate and or the House for the at-risk populations that you write about? I suppose that would be true. The question would apply to foreign populations as well as domestic ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dick Durbin is Senator Durbin from Illinois is somebody who, you know, repeatedly is speaking out on behalf of human rights abuses just all around the world, including places like Sudan. And there are a number of Jeff Merkley, here in Oregon has done that as well. And in the House, there have been champions as well. Um, but it's, it. I've been disappointed by this White House in that regard. I've known Joe Biden for many years, and he was a voice for human rights during in the 90s, during Bosnia, during Darfur in the 2000s. And from my point of view, he has failed morally in the Gaza crisis and also in Sudan. And hasn't provided enough leadership in other places like Myanmar, like Haiti, and so on. And he's done a magnificent job in East Asia, I think, knitting together countries like the Philippines and South Korea, Japan, Australia, as a force to vis-a-vis China. But on these kind of moral issues, I've been really disappointed.
Here's something from Barbara, who has a question. She says about how to be hopeful in stressful times. I'm frightened by actions by the LA Times, the Washington Post, ABC, and others. We talked about this earlier, caving into Trump, plus all of his threats against his enemies. How concerned are you about the freedom of the press under the upcoming administration? Please walk me down from my cliff. Pardon me.
So I don't think that I'm going to be sent to Guantanamo. And, I will continue to criticize Trump. I don't think that we're going to turn into North Korea or Russia. Now, could we turn into something much closer to Hungary or to Poland under the previous government? Absolutely. And I think that is my concern that Trump and people around him use lawsuits to intimidate news organizations, and especially these corporate entities that in turn control news organizations, where I think companies are easier to intimidate. Can he get rid of civil servants who are more neutral, who aren't partisans? I think that's a real risk. Could the Department of Justice be weaponized? Could the military be much more politicized in ways that would damage the professionalism of the military and undermine democracy. Yeah, I worry about all that. I also worry, one of the things I've seen in other countries is that violence um, can become more common in societies as people become polarized, and that can come from either left or right, and that we have a jury system that requires unanimity to convict. It can become difficult in a really polarized climate to get all 12 people to convict somebody for a violent offense. And I guess I worry that if people were then, even if arrested and prosecuted, were then to be acquitted by these sort of juries of nullification, that would create impunity. That would encourage um, other acts. And, you know, this, I worry about this from the right, partly because I'm more on the left, but the murder of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare executive, and the degree to which people on the left were in some cases celebrating that murder, that really troubled me. And um, I worry about that kind of disintegration of civil society because again, I've seen that in other countries.
You don't think that it might lead ultimately to some improvement in the health system?
I'm very skeptical that murdering the head of United
Not the
Health.
murder itself, obviously, but the fact that there's been so much attention to on the medical system as a result of that unforgivable crime.
So, in general, I think attention is a to those issues is healthy and is good, and maybe that will bring some improvement. I think scrutiny is always helpful, but fundamentally, I think we just have a really screwed up healthcare system that has really lousy incentives for everybody, and I don't think that I think that has to be resolved at the federal level rather than the state level, in contrast to some other problems. And I don't think there is going to be a serious step toward moving toward more equitable um, evidence-based interventions in the next 4 years. I do think Obama and Biden took some steps in that direction. I think we're going to take steps away from that in the next 4 years.
This is hardly a question that leads to having being hopeful, but just today, it appears that the Congress is not getting together to bail the government out for the next year, and then we have to have a government shutdown as early as this coming Saturday. Once again, not a reason for being hopeful. That apparently has a lot to do with Elon Musk, who was railing against this bill that had been proposed by the Speaker of the Congress, and now he is being denounced as well. He may not even be reelected as a result of all of this. Trump saying, or Musk saying that the voice of the people has triumphed. He seems to be the voice of the people at the moment, or somehow they have been equated in his mind.
Um, yeah, I mean, Elon Musk is such a complicated person in that he's just been a genius in one area after another. And, from obviously Tesla cars to, brain interfaces to rocketry and to production, to not just the ideas. And yet he's been just utterly a catastrophe in the way he ran Twitter and many of his public proclamations, reducing the value of anything the moment he walks into the room. So I think I have a lot of trouble kind of understanding what's going to happen there. But Warren, can I just, since we're talking about hope and I think we're coming across as a little bit sort of hopeless. Can I just offer a little bit of how?
Please do. Yes, lay it on.
So, I mean, people always, frankly, they are curious that I've had a career covering war and human trafficking and genocide and atrocities and poverty and emerged hopeful. And I really have. And I think it's because of a couple of things. And I think one is that we have cognitive biases that I think lead us to focus on all that is going wrong. and those are real. But there is a backdrop of progress that I have in particular seen because I've spent so much of my career on the front lines. And, for example, maybe the worst thing that can happen to somebody is to lose a child. When I was born, 1/5 of all children died before the age of 5. When I graduated from high school, I think it was, or from college, I think it was 11% of children died before the age of 5. Now we're down to 3%. And it's still way too many, but boy, that is real progress. Every day, another 300,000 people more or less emerge from extreme poverty around the world. Um, and so, and one thing that is going to happen in the next 4 years could be threats to democracy, not just in the US, in Europe, elsewhere. Um, and those are real, but they're also technological changes that are going to be transformative. They're extraordinary improvements in sustainable energy and solar and battery power. And so I was just in rural Madagascar. Lives can be improved by these new technologies that provide electricity, that can power pumps that bring water for irrigation, that feed people, and this kind of thing. And I guess the other reason that I've emerged optimistic is that side by side with the worst of humanity, you always find the best. And so I talked about in China, watching the government mow down protesters. But there was also that bus driver who emerged and showed this incredible courage and strength. And I've seen that over and over. That was reported repeatedly in a village in the Punjab in Pakistan. And Warren, I think we've even talked about her before. A friend of mine, Mukhtar Mai, this Pakistani woman who had been sentenced by a village council to be gang raped for something that her younger brother had done. And then the village council, they carried out that sentence. They gang raped Mukhtar. And their expectation was that she would then kill herself out of shame. And instead, Mukhtar somehow found it in herself to report the crime, to to prosecute her attackers, to send them to prison. And then she used the compensation money for that rape to start the first school in her village because she believed that education was the best way to chip away at the kind of misogyny and cruelty that had victimized her. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school. And you just couldn't be in this little village in Punjab and see the children of her attackers in their little uniforms studying Urdu in the classroom and just not feel that at our best, we can be a pretty amazing species capable of extraordinary strength and courage and resilience if we can just channel these in the right direction. And that is our mission and challenge for all of us.
Let me make the point that, and I apologize for the role that I have played in making it difficult to be hopeful about a lot of the things that we've talked about. Because in your book, you make that point again and again, and I think people should know that the book does have a hopeful cast to it for exactly the reasons that you just enunciated. So I'll take responsibility for the hopelessness of the day and send people to the book who are looking for a better way. I want to just end with another quote from Jeffrey Toobin, who said that made the point about you and Indiana Jones. He said, "I'm not surprised to see him emerge as the moral conscience of our generation of journalists." I don't know a lot of people who have been who have had that said about them in my experience, and I've been a journalist for a long time. So again, it's been a real privilege for me to talk to you, and I'm an admirer, and I know our audiences as well. And thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, thank you, Warren. And thanks everybody for joining in. It's a privilege to talk about this. And I know this is a group that also cares deeply about these issues. So thank you for caring about these crises all around the world.
Thanks again.